Welcome back to another episode. Today, I'm very excited to be hosting another conversation. This time, it is between Andrés again and Stephen Snyder. Stephen, why don't you say a few words, introduce yourself for those who don't know who you are and what you do?
Sure. Well, I'm a Buddhist teacher, both in the Theravadan Buddhist, a lineage teacher in the Theravadan Buddhist tradition, and also lineage teacher in the Zen tradition. I've been teaching for about 15 years and meditating going on 50 years now. I've written a number of books. My fifth book will be out at the end of this year. The fourth one just came out, Demystifying Awakening. And I teach at my website, awakeningdharma.org.
Thanks, Stephen. And I really recommend to those listening, Stephen's books are great. Go check them out. And Andrés?
Yeah, one of the co-founders of the Quelia Research Institute, which is a small organization that seeks to elucidate the mathematical properties of consciousness. And yeah, I mean, along the way, we have identified pragmatic solutions to tackle extreme pain, as well as, yeah, essentially like narrow down on like really promising sets of experiences to investigate in order to, yeah, essentially elucidate what is the structure of things such as valence and emotional updating. So I'm very, very excited to be here and bounce some of these ideas and models off of Stephen and yeah, see what happens essentially.
Okay, great. Thanks both for your introductions. And I think a lot of what we're going to be talking about today are these profound altered states of consciousness known in Buddhism as the jhanas. We're probably going to diverge. It's a free-ranging conversation without much structure. But I think that for Andrés, your purposes, and jump in here to tell me if I'm off here. From a theoretical perspective, these altered states are some of the more interesting in that they present kind of a radically different mode of consciousness, both during the state itself and then as a possibility for transforming one's default state. Is that on track?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, as a disclaimer, I don't personally have access to the jhanas, although I'm slowly working towards that. But yeah, I mean, most of my experience base, yeah, comes from other sources. But essentially, jhanas do seem especially interesting for two reasons. I mean, first of all, they play with attention and awareness, and in a very, very, highly, I suppose, like specified way. Like they're really, really, like talking about concentration. If you want to understand concentration, it seems like jhanas are a really, really key piece of the puzzle. The other thing, though, is they interface very, very heavily with valence. I mean, essentially, people feel there's a positive hedonic quality to jhanas. And the fact as well that as you progress on them, essentially the experiences become simpler, seem to go in line with a very core paradigm at QRI that is called the symmetry theory of valence, which is essentially this idea that there is a very, very tight relationship between how pleasant an experience is and how symmetrical it is. Now, how symmetrical it is may actually manifest in many ways. I mean, there is, for example, temporal symmetry, which is like how regular kind of the time slices of your experiences are, how regular the intervals are between them, but also like the phenomenal space, like the feeling of space itself, whenever it's smoother and it has doesn't have wrinkles or pinch points or shearing or stress, that also would kind of make it more symmetrical. But there's many other ways in which symmetry may manifest. And at the very, very high end of the jhanas, when you're talking about, experience of infinite space or boundless space or nothingness and things like that, it really does seem to be like those are like states of consciousness with very little information content. And yet people describe them as, very high level of well-being, even if it's not, typical classical pleasure as we conceptualize it in normal human society. It is still some variety of well-being. And to us, that connection is really, really interesting and promising. So I guess for a little bit of context, the sort of studies that we're very excited to actually conduct is essentially measures of symmetry in brain activity, and correlating them with essentially, yeah, fMRI or MEG, EEG of advanced jhanas. And I mean, at least insofar as like EEG is concerned with the lower jhanas, there seems to be some interesting correlations here. But yeah, it's too early in the research to really say nail down this particular correlation. But yeah, that's as a matter of introduction for why it's interesting for us.
Okay, thanks so much. And Stephen, by way of introduction, maybe you could give just a brief boilerplate description of the lineage in which you were taught the jhanas and how it may differ from other notions of jhana that are circling around.
Yeah, I was taught by a teacher from Myanmar, Paul Oksai, and he's pretty, I'd say, the majority of folks in the West would regard him as somebody who was very attained, both as a scholar and a meditation master. And he also is known to have the most rigorous of the jhanas in terms of what is jhana. The bar is higher. And again, I don't say that in any hierarchical way, just I think it's common knowledge that they're the hardest. So, and we look at it that they're more exacting rather than hard. Yeah, but it's a, he's someone who uses the suttas, the Buddha's sermons, as well as the Visuddhimagga, which is a meditation manual written in, I don't know, 500 or 600, something like that, that details these practices and more.
All right, thank you. And from here on out, I think I will just leave you two to it. I may interject if there's some kind of misunderstanding or I want to clarify something for the audience, but other than that, I'll pretty much just be hanging out here in the background, being a fly on the wall, enjoying the conversation. So please go ahead, guys.
Sure. Let me just start on this. I would say how I would define jhana would be a no-self merger with a non-dual state as just a general perspective. And then, of course, the state would be very different based upon the jhana and the practice that accesses that jhana. Those are all, they're, I hate to say conditioned, but they influence the experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, something that was really interesting to me. I saw your interview with Guru Viking. It's like, yeah, it seems like your main, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but like your main kind of approach towards the jhana is through loving kindness. Is that correct?
It is. That's more where I'm focusing, but with all the Brahmavihārās, so all the heart practices, I find them easier for people to access jhana. And of course, if jhana doesn't arise, there's still so much good juiciness, heart juiciness in the practice, rather than with the breath awareness, the anapanasati, there can be a lot of striving and a lot of disappointment and self-judgment if one doesn't progress in the practice. So for that reason, I find it a little bit better access for folks.
Yeah. So the thing that sparks my interest right away in terms of that combination or that access point is that I guess the Brahmavihārās in general, but loving kindness including, seem to me also to be essentially recruiting a special kind of a symmetry or smoothness of experience. I mean, some people describe like essentially very intense meta experiences as, I mean, the terms that I've heard is things such as, and also from a meditation retreat I attended, like smoothness of space and time and some kind of a balance and reciprocity in your representations of others. And that might be potentially a very helpful platform to kind of like seed the conditions for jhana, if that's your concentration object. Mm-hmm. It also seems like from a lot of phenomenology and also like neuroscience that there's this kind of like paradigm of perception. Winston and I have also talked about this. I think we talked about it in a different podcast, which is that essentially in this model, your experience is a balance of forces. And what you're experiencing is kind of like every part of your experience is trying to expand as much as possible but is being constrained by every other part of the experience. It's just kind of like a beach is a balance of forces, can only happen if the conditions of wind and water and the currents are all there for it to actually balance out. Likewise, like a particular scene, whether it's like visual field or any other sense, or they what results is kind of this balance of forces. But then with very heavy concentration, it's sort of like you're taking one aspect of your experience and then letting it expand across your entire experience and just become that. So it seems, hypothetically, that if your object of concentration itself is like very smooth, very symmetrical in one way, that may potentially influence the overarching quality of the state once you have like actually expanded it over the entire experience. I wonder if you might comment on this on this approach.
Sure. Yeah, I think what you say makes sense. I think there's truth to that. And a couple of things. One way that I teach the Brahmavihārās, the heart qualities, say with metta, rather than calling it loving kindness, I call it an unconditioned universal love. Because I consider these to be qualities of the absolute, which is the source in Buddhism, absolute reality. And that means they're qualities of each of our true nature. So rather than focusing on an emotion or a thought emotion to work with, we're really trying to discern what's already here and also is unconditioned. So we don't need to generate it. We don't need to manufacture it. We're just getting in touch with something that's always existing. So that changes the dynamic in the relationship. So it's less dependent on me making it. And then the other component is in the process of developing or expanding or entering, having jhana arise and entering jhana, is there has to be two things. One, a certain amount of surrender, not complete surrender, but something close to that. And then the reason the jhanas are so helpful, the Brahmavihārās are helpful with jhana is because what keeps us from entering jhana? We have certain resistances, typically around worry, some type of fear, and loss of control. And that's also something that the heart practices help. We develop more trust, we let go more easily. So it's going to help us. And also there's that deep-seated fear, that ego deficiency. Well, everybody else here is going to get it probably, but not me, because I've done something bad. I'm unlovable. I'm worthless. I'm lousy. Whatever the story is. And so again, Brahmavihārās help fill that in a way that we're not sort of mired in that deficiency approaching the practice.
Fascinating. Yeah, there's a couple things that come out of this. I mean, one very brief, I guess, side note is like, do you think there might be a correlation between like ease of entry and actually, how much how moral you've been behaving recently? I mean, I'd imagine like teaching Brahmavihārās at a prison might be potentially challenging, especially if people have actually, murdered somebody recently or something like that. Do you think like that might be there might be a correlation there?
Well, the two things. One's sila, as we call it, which is behavior, wholesome behavior, absolutely plays a role in this. So really just the more we're doing that's in symmetry and leaves the less wake behind us, the less cleanup we have to do. And I will say I've got two students who do teach some of the Brahmavihārās to prison inmates. And those who they self-select into the group, but those that self-select, the majority are able to get in contact with metta, or what I teach is another practice called innate goodness. And they're able to get in touch with it, with the exception of the sociopaths and psychopaths. They can't easily do it. And so my advice to the students was ask each of them, what do you need to access this? Because it seems very individualistic based upon their psychological structuring. And I'm not very well trained in psychology, but just, from what I understand, that was my recommendation to them. They're actually trained in psychology, the folks who are doing it.
Okay, yeah, fascinating. Yeah. Okay, so maybe a little bit of a context for kind of furthering the conversation. So two broad ideas. The first one is at QRI, essentially a very core paradigm is what we call qualia formalism. So essentially, this is the idea that for any given experience, there is a corresponding mathematical object, such that the mathematical features of that object are isomorphic to the phenomenology of the experience. I mean, essentially, we're trying to formalize consciousness in the same way as, let's say, Maxwell formalized electromagnetism. That, like, some people might have thought of before that, hey, like there's like lightning and electricity and magnets, and like they seem kind of related, but it's unclear. And it might have turned out that, you know, the seeming relationship between them was incidental. But then it turns out that there's really just like 4 relatively simple differential equations that tie all of that phenomena together. Essentially, it's something like that we think might happen to consciousness. That right now, you know, we talk about all of these exotic states of consciousness, whether it's Jhānas or LSD or you know, like extreme pain or something like that. And we may think of them as like very disparate kind of like algorithms. They may not necessarily have like a common core. But at QRI, essentially, we work under the assumption that at some point, we're actually going to discover a core set of equations and mathematical objects such that the different configurations of those mathematical objects will map on to each of these states of consciousness. So we kind of like play a lot with that framework. I mean, we have like candidate ideas of like what these mathematical objects are, but even without like getting into kind of like that level of rigor, this lens is still very generative in the sense that, for example, it gives us ideas for how to potentially describe various states of consciousness. And I'll put a pin on this to circle back to it in a second. For like kind of like rough ideas for like what the Brahmavihārās might be doing. But the other kind of like important piece of background is this distinction between recipe and review of a state. That one thing is kind of like what are the instructions that you follow in order to cultivate a particular state of consciousness. And then a different thing is essentially what is the quality of the consciousness that arises once you follow those instructions. And it's kind of analogous to looking at the recipe versus the review of a cake that you cook, right? It's like the cooking instructions may actually look very, very uninformative about what the actual taste of the resulting cake is. You know, adding yeast and the temperature and all of that doesn't really tell you very much about like, okay, what is it going to taste, unless you have a lot of experience of how those things map. So based on kind of like that framework, I wonder if, and I hope I'm not getting into any, controversial territory or anything, but I wonder if, for example, like talking about the Brahmavihārās as kind of like properties of the absolute might be perhaps understood as kind of a recipe for those states. That is kind of like your if you can believe that that is the case, then like the mind doesn't raise any objections when, let's say, the experiential qualities of the Brahmavihārās actually start to expand into all of your experience, because they become recognized as properties of the absolute, whether that is, you know, the case or not, but it might function as a recipe. So, well, I said a lot of things, but I wonder your overall reaction here.
Yeah, the way I would take is like the instructions for the practices. The one question I'd have, though, is because these states are also non-conceptual, you know, there is the problem of conceptualizing. So, you know, that's sort of built into the mathematical equation, that there's a certain perspective of consciousness from a mind that has concept, and of course the experiential and direct experience may be no concept. So
Yeah.
And one other point, with the particularly with the what we call the upper, the formless jhanas, which, as you mentioned, the base of boundless space, the base of boundless consciousness, the base of boundless no thingness, and the base of neither perception or non-perception. And from my perspective, each of those is a differentiated characteristic of the absolute. And as we go in and merge with that jhana, and our consciousness and awareness get steeped in that, and really the jhana experience is like being in a radio frequency territory. And in effect, the consciousness is getting acclimated and attuned to that frequency. And only when that frequency lands sufficiently would it be possible for one to then move on to the next jhana with success. And the ultimate objective is, as I present it, is what I call the ninth jhana, which is the absolute itself. That we can, after the eighth, if there's sufficient, let's say, purification of mind, then it's possible to, and I have led students to access the absolute directly. So they're sitting in source, they're merged in source. And some of that opens up to the experiences in Theravadan Buddhism called cessation, which is the same as nirvana or nirvana. It's the ceasing of all mentality and materiality, all consciousness and awareness, a lights out experience.
Yeah, no, this is really excellent to hear. There's so many threads, but I'll choose the most salient one. So remember, I put a pin on kind of like, okay, from the Quelia formalist perspective, like what a loving kindness might be. So, and now you mentioned about kind of like tuning into a particular frequency for essentially the various jhanas. So at QRI, essentially, we take very seriously this idea that there's actually like frequencies of experience. And we think essentially they map onto what are called the connectum-specific harmonic waves of a nervous system. So essentially the nervous system, similar to like any mechanical object that has like waves, mechanical waves that propagate, it will have its corresponding harmonics, which essentially are all of the ways in which the waves will fit an integer number of times in the particular shape. Except that in the case of the brain, is not actually mechanical waves, it is electromagnetic waves that essentially, follow the excitation inhibition wavefront that describes the behavior of collectives of neurons. In a kind of like one of the early theory papers that we presented here, it's called the Neuroscience for Meditation by Mike Johnson, one of my colleagues. Essentially, he hypothesizes that a lot of what meditation is doing is essentially avoiding energy to get stuck in particular constructs, which would be kind of like non-linearities in the system, and instead channeling that energy to just the natural harmonic resonances of the nervous system. And kind of like a metaphor for this is if you have a tuning fork and it has like some mud in it, in a sense, like meditating and activating the central harmonics of your nervous system would be kind of like shaking off the mud off of it and just kind of ends up being kind of like a cleaner resonance. So based on your interview with Guru Viking, it sounded like a lot of practitioners in Zen maybe would do that for kind of the third chakra, kind of stomach area, but maybe not necessarily for the heart area. How does this metaphor sit with you?
It's fairly accepted in the Zen tradition that there's a lot of emphasis on emptiness, what we call emptiness. I use the word absence rather than emptiness because emptiness implies nothing and absence implies something, but it's just not quite here. But the one place that's lacking is there are no practices, there are no heart practices. And there's several Zen teachers who I work with and friends with, and we're of the opinion that that would be a wonderful thing to introduce into the Zen world. And so we're hoping to start doing some retreats that do that. And I've been teaching several Zen masters the Brahmavihārās for their own practice, and then hopefully able to show them how to teach it with folks, and then they can do some of that too. So I think, but it's that balance, because really, in the absolute, the way that I present it, experience it, is that there's sort of two functions: one unmanifest, which is really more the emptiness quality, and one the manifest, which is more presence and love and the manifestation, really function of it. So, but it's the balance. And like in the Theravadan, they've got a lot of depth in the presence and love through the Brahmavihārās, but less with the emptiness. And the Zen folks have more of the emptiness, but less of the presence and love. So the more each side develops of the other, the more you're going to get somebody who's more steeped in the absolute. And that gives hopefully an invitation for experiences like jhana, like awakening experiences, things like that.
Yeah, fascinating.
But that would tie in, let me jump from one more thing. I think that would tie into your harmonics perspective, that there needs to be sort of a development of let's say, both functions of the absolute in order for us to really have a kind of a wholesome entry. That makes sense. And also, I think the landing, how it would land in our consciousness, would be different based upon how we enter and where we drink from, let's say.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, an additional thing about the quality. So one thing is going to be the frequency, and that it will be highly correlated with kind of like where in the body you actually have it. And there might be like some very deep reasons why. I mean, it's similar to kind of a musical instrument. Different parts of the musical instrument will have essentially different frequencies. When you have like a shorter, guitar string, or tighter guitar string, or thinner string, you will have like higher frequencies. So, we've done a little bit of work of like actually taking, there's this device, it's called a saw pack that vibrates to the tune of music, but also you can tune it to whatever frequency you want, and putting it on different parts of the body, and in a blinded way, like asking somebody where in their body a particular frequency resonates more. And yeah, it does seem to be actually there's like stronger resonances with particular frequencies across the body, with like roughly speaking, kind of higher frequencies corresponding like closer to the head, and lower frequencies below. But it seems to me that like another piece of the puzzle is essentially what is the waveform characteristic. And this became pretty apparent when I started cultivating metta a couple of years ago, that it felt to me that metta had this very kind of like soft wave quality, that if you think of the quality of our attention, and these may or may not be a metaphor, but it's kind of like sending waves of energy to objects of perception within your experience, and then the way in which those waves of energy bounce off of them, essentially both conditions what the property of the object will be, but also gives you information about that object, and it makes it ring in a particular way. I got the pretty strong impression that a lot of like what loving kindness is kind of like developing a sensibility to essentially send waves of energy that have like a very soft, what would be called a attack. So waveforms, one way of describing the envelope of a waveform is attack, decay, sustained release. It's called a ADSR in a lot of musicians are familiar with this, which actually distinguishes, let's say, the quality of sound of different musical instruments. That is not only kind of like the weight of all of the harmonics, which is one property of instruments, but it's also, how fast the sound comes on and how slowly it decays. And yeah, I got the impression that something like a characteristic of loving kindness is that the attack is very smooth. So you're not actually kind of hitting the objects of perception. You're more kind of like slowly tuning into them. Is that something you could relate to?
Well, I'd say a little differently in that I think when doing the Brahmavihārās, metta, and others, part of what's happening is that we're getting into the resonance of that unconditioned heart quality. And so that's where that smoothness would come in, I think, and the wave business you're talking about, but there's also a softening of distinction, meaning I'm doing metta for you, you're becoming softer, I'm becoming softer. So there's a unity, a oneness that's coming in to where I can't tell if I'm doing it for myself or you, but there's metta transpiring in our field.
Yeah. Okay, so the other characteristic also worth mentioning is this concept is called impedance matching. Most people know it from electrical engineering, but essentially it is this this overall idea that like you could actually have like very high levels of energy and resonance, but if you don't have an intermediate medium that allows the essentially the spreading of energy between them, they're going to be like fairly non-interactive. So the metaphor I often use to explain this is if you have like a guitar string that is essentially just like tied in at, let's say, the two ends of of the walls of a room, and you pluck it, it's going to be very, very quiet. If the guitar string, on the other hand, is attached to an actual acoustic guitar, it's going to sound a lot more loud. And this is very puzzling because, hey, the amount of energy that you put into the guitar string is the same in either direction. So it's kind of like puzzling how like a musical instrument would actually add energy to it. And the answer is that it doesn't actually add energy to it in any way. What is happening, though, is that the energy gets dissipated more quickly because the energy of the string essentially makes the entire object vibrate. And then the entire object vibrating has much bigger surface area to interact with the surrounding air. So that would be a phenomenon of impedance matching, where essentially there's an intermediate medium that is essentially synchronizing the air and the guitar string. So it's felt to me that, I mean, both on various kinds of psychotropic substances and various kinds of meditation, but especially the Brahmavihārās, it feels subjectively to me that like you might be also cultivating higher impedance matching within your nervous system. So essentially making it easier for your representations of, let's say, people or representations of objects to essentially softly loosen their boundaries.
Yeah, exactly.
And ultimately synchronizing in the resonant frequency. Okay.
Yeah, but that's a lot because a lot of this is softening the sense of who I am. It's softening my sense of body boundaries. So where I am moving in more into the mystery, into that unified field that we can know something of, but we can't always conceptualize it. So that's part of the mystery of it all, which is beautiful too.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, that's awesome. Like, I guess one thing I might say, it's yeah, you've referenced kind of like the difficulty of conceptualizing a non-conceptual experience.
Right.
I mean, I would describe myself as a epistemological optimist. In that, like, a lot of these things that seem like impossible, I think they might just like be really tricky or like non-trivial, but maybe possible. And I mean, of course, like I recognize if you're actually conceptualizing, creating a model, that's different from the experience itself. Like that's
Right.
that's
And
definitely the case.
That's the crux of it. Now, I do have a little bit of a wild card for you.
Yeah.
I had students begin reporting for a few years that when I teach, they were feeling a transmission. And so I decided to see if I could incorporate that more into my teaching. And so I started doing some guided meditations like there's one on Guru Viking, Absolute Peace Meditation. And it's just what I'm doing is I'm describing what's happening in my consciousness in real time. And I'm finding, like I just finished a retreat in Croatia, and I did it probably 3 times a day. I did a guided meditation, and virtually everybody can follow right along and are deeply impacted with whatever it is arising, because it's in our field. So, I mean, it's really curious to me. I have no understanding of why it works. There's no technique to it. It just happens. But there must be some symmetry and, as you would say, smoothness of waves in the field for people to be able to follow. And what's particularly interesting is some people are brand new to meditation. So it's not even dependent upon their having enough experience to have some of these meditative practices or experiences.
Yeah, that's. Go ahead, Winston.
Yeah, I just thought I'd add coming out of Shinzen Young's like unified mindfulness teacher training, that this is something that is heavily emphasized within the training, that as you're guiding a meditation, you must always actually be doing the meditation. And I'd like to hear Andrés's thoughts on this, but the kind of empathic matching that can happen between two people, even with eyes closed, you can kind of entrain yourself to another person in that process of guidance, and in certain circumstances kind of reach beyond what your normal capacity would be. That's been my experience, both teaching and receiving guidance, that is a phenomenon that happens. So I'd love to hear what you think is going on there, Andrés.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, I'll say three things that can be said about this. And the first one is, the discussion of like, how would you tell subjectively whether this is, let's say, like synchronizing with your internal representation of your meditation teacher, and using it as kind of like an internal metronome, but the transmission being an illusion, versus there actually being some kind of real transmission besides that. The second thing is, essentially, this does seem like very testable, and I would love to actually run an experiment. And I think like the main concern is that, of course, like as you're guiding a session, I'm sure like the actual state of consciousness in which you are will modify your body language and the tone of voice, and the attack, decay, sustain, release envelope of your voice and things like that. But I think like that's experimentally not difficult to overcome. I mean, essentially what we could do is have you record a guided session, and then and do it while you were in the state, like being truthful about your experience. And then we could run a study where essentially in one condition you follow along with those states of consciousness as people hear the recording in synchrony. So you're hearing your own recording and they're hearing their own recording, the same recording at the same time, versus the other condition where everybody hears the same recording, but you are specifically in a different state. You're like listening to rock music or something like that, just to make sure you're actually not following along the meditation. And if there is a kind of like actual transmission, we would expect there to be like a difference in the effect size of the meditation effects on the people. Would that be a study you'd be interested in conducting at some point?
Yeah, we could explore it to see how that would work. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, but yeah, this is definitely something I've heard reported. I mean, I was very, very skeptical at first, but I've heard it from like, yeah, enough like credible people and people having like pretty unusual experiences of, yeah, like for example, like in monasteries, I've heard like sometimes they identify somebody who kind of like works as a radiator, and it might not be somebody who's actually the most talented or the most attained, but they somehow have this quality of being able to radiate a state. And they might position that person kind of like closer to the center of the room because it just like makes meditation easier for everybody or something of that nature. And I guess, yeah, the last thing is like exploring like possible mechanisms of action here. And I think like there really would be kind of like two overarching camps. Like one is this an electromagnetic phenomenon or is this a quantum phenomenon? And yeah, of course, if I start introducing quantum mechanics, my credibility is gonna go down all the way to zero. It's very, very hard to say something like meaningful and rigorous there. But with electromagnetism, there are things that you could expect. Like if we find, for example, the frequency range in which the brain is operating, or where these like frequencies are operating, there might be a way of essentially introducing intentional noise between people with an actual electromagnetic radiator between you and them, and that in principle would disrupt the the transmission. So it would be an interesting way of testing it.
Sounds interesting.
So I guess, yeah, to kind of put that on the table, the conceptualizing non-conceptual experiences and maybe the absolute. There's this distinction that is done in neuroscience and psychology, which is the difference between attention and awareness. So awareness is like going on all the time, but then attention is kind of like picking specific features of your experience and binding them together. And something that I've noticed, or I also hypothesize as kind of like one of the paradigms at QRI, essentially, whenever there is attention, there is essentially this resonance between attention and the awareness field, the field of awareness. So it's not really only that, you know, you're kind of like paying attention to something, but there's usually kind of like a background that attention is resonating with and is carrying the information of it. And maybe this is kind of like easier to see when you have like these very highly concentrated states where, let's say, the entirety of the background is resonating with a point. And it's kind of like there's a duality that, yes, you're absorbed into one point, but then that point is actually also resonating with the entire field. And there's kind of this back and forth. Or there's also like states of consciousness where actually awareness and attention actually kind of like switch positions. One can become the other. So you could like be paying attention to one point and is resonating with the rest of your experience, but then slowly growing the area you're paying attention to until it encompasses half of your experience. And when it encompasses half of your experience, essentially you're going to have like two sides of your experience resonating with each other. Mm-hmm. And then if you keep expanding it, then you can turn essentially what was the awareness field into what is now an attention point. So in that sense, I essentially think of attention and awareness as like codependent phenomena that essentially involve resonance. And it seems to me that potentially like conceptualization is really an attention phenomena. You're kind of making these perceptual constructs and embedding information in them. But actually a lot of like the juicy quality of your experience is in the awareness field, which there's an epistemological difficulty here because by the moment you actually pay attention to it, you reify it and you're changing the quality of it. So I guess this is kind of the conceptual framework I would use for like sense of something like the absolute, like why it's very much like a real experience you could have. You know, the moment you pay attention to it and you try to describe it, actually you're like breaking it apart. But you could still study it in various ways. Yeah, I wonder how you might react to all of these.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little hard. I don't follow all that you're talking about. You know, I'm not that educated in that, but I think it's really just an interesting discussion. And I think particularly what struck me was the interface of the awareness and attention. Like I have in my one book, Demystifying Awakening, I talk about how with awakening that there's I just made up this thing called the 51% rule, that if 51% of consciousness has the direct experience of true nature, of the absolute, and identifies with it, sees this is me, then there's a different kind of experience where true nature becomes the foundation rather than the personality from then on. So there's something really interesting in that 51% place or more. But you know, the fulcrum just tips, and it can be very revolutionary in its impact. I have a couple of students, since I've come out with my book, I've had 3 students who have Kensho experiences, awakening experiences, one on the retreat I just did. So now I'm helping them sort of guide through the next steps, which is where there are times when they're completely steeped in true nature and times when they flip into the personality, even though it's like there's no gas running that engine, it's still sputtering. And so it's back and forth, reconciling the two and recognizing sort of the dysfunction of the personality activity to where that has to be liberated for the true nature to really begin to function. in that individual consciousness. At least that's how I'd frame it. You might see it and name it differently.
That's fascinating. I mean, that suggests there might be possibly something in the direction of like a kind of like a center of mass of your whole experience. And if yeah, there's kind of like 51% or more of a certain quality of attention, that might recenter essentially where you're positioned within your entire experience. I guess I intuitively visualize it as kind of like yeah, the resonant modes of a molecule or something like that, that like there's actually like a resonance mode which is like the lowest harmonic, which is how the entire molecule vibrates. And maybe you probably had first kind of like pieces of it vibrate in a like way, but there's a critical phase transition that happens when you actually get the flavor of the resonance of the entire molecule to actually have that quality. And yeah, definitely, I guess it resonates with the personal experience. At least in like kind of like, for example, changing your mood or like exiting a depression. there does seem to be kind of a phase transition, maybe at the 51% intuitively. Yeah.
This is super fascinating. I wonder if I might just inject two like cases of this kind of threshold of this 51%. So I don't have very much experience of the kind of jhana that is described by Stephen and in the Visuddhimagga, but I have had experiences which might be on the edge, or I was there for a couple of seconds, and it is that kind of being sucked in and really just merging. Your entire experience is that quality. If it's you're merging with a nimitta, it's just that. The body, everything is just gone. You're kind of sucked in and totally merged. And I think that is kind of a threshold effect. And I'm hoping Stephen will be able to comment better on this, because I really don't have that much experience with it. And then the other thing is the kind of non-dual experience, where the distinction between a subject in here and a world out there, how that can kind of collapse as well, I think is one of these threshold effects, where maybe there might be some synchrony between attention and awareness. Or I suppose how I would describe it, and Andrés, maybe you can comment on this, is that there isn't any distinction between attention and awareness, or the movement of attention is kind of experienced as a movement of the larger field. And maybe you could both comment on that. I just wanted to interject there. I suppose mainly for my own benefit, I'm curious what you would both say about all that.
Yeah, I guess I'll jump in. With the jhana experience, I think that's the common experience, is that there's no normal sense of self. There's full awareness and perception, but there's no sense of self, there's no thought. So it's non-conceptual direct experience, and yet people have uniform experiences. They'll be a little different, but for the most part, the majority of it is identical. And that's part of the way that there can be sort of a quality control, because the teachers withhold some of the things that'll be experienced there, and the student needs to reveal those hidden parts in order for us to be confirming what's happening. I mean, there's also the energetic resonance, where for me, I can feel when somebody is in that territory, just the vibration is different, and I'm familiar with that tone, so I know in that way as well. And one other thing I wanted to introduce, I don't know if you've read any of the Carlos Castaneda material. If that's familiar to either one of you, I probably outdate you here with that. But anyway, he was a anthropology student who worked with a shaman and wrote about it, and it was quite popular 1970 on. But anyway, one of the main point I'm making from this is they talked a lot about a shift in what they called an assemblage point, and that the shift would actually open one to essentially different universes or different worlds or dramatically different experiences where the rules of reality were different. And I think the more I practice and work with students, the more I think there is something to that shift, because there's a shift of sort of where we're anchored in our consciousness. And if it anchors someplace else, that viewpoint can be dramatically different from our normal perception. and our normal view of reality can change dramatically. So anyway, I just want to introduce that as well, because I think there's something interesting about the shamanic practices, and and again, I'm on the fence about the use of psychedelics. I don't know whether they actually help or whether they don't help, but I know people report benefit from them some, and some people had trouble. So it's, just to say I'm not a I don't have an opinion either way about it.
Okay, and I mean, I guess to follow up on that, there's definitely three substances. I'd be curious to hear your thought as well. Maybe you already shared everything, but I mean, a lot of Buddhists who lived in the 70s, I guess, do seem to, is a very story of like saying like, yeah, I mean, essentially they tried LSD at some point, had like some kind of a non-dual experience, and then they realized that like, okay, like there's probably something to meditation, and then they went through a meditation path. But like a lot of people cite kind of like early psychedelic experiences as pretty formative, or at least like something that pointed them in a new direction. And there's like, yeah, I don't know how much you might know about these three drugs, but like the ones that I'd be the most curious about is LSD, MDMA, and 5-MeO-DMT. I wonder if you've heard about the last one, but
Is that the toad one?
yes.
Yeah, I don't know the name, but I know it as the toad phenomenon. Yeah, I have students who have done all those. Some of them report all sorts of experiences, from full jhanas to awakening experiences. The one difference is their energy resonance about it is different. So if they talk about jhana, there's just a vibration in them that's not the same as somebody who does it meditatively. So again, I'm not saying they're not having the experience. I'm not with them when it happens, but just their reporting of it, there's just a little different frequency how it feels to me.
Yeah. I can comment on, I mean, on why at a theoretical level that might happen. Again, this is pretty speculative, but the way I might describe this is that, like, okay, like why would a psychedelic make it easier for you to access, like, say, like Jhānic-like qualities of experience? So the way we think about it at QRI is that many substances, one of the things they do is that they change the wave propagation dynamics in your nervous system. And like our nervous system is like finely tuned towards our natural wave propagation dynamics. So the moment you introduce a new wave propagation dynamic, essentially a lot of your pre-existing constructs will not actually synchronize or get in tune with it. So all of a sudden you may actually be able to disentangle from them and experience the resonant modes of your nervous system in a clean way, except that they're the resonant modes of this altered nervous system.
Right.
So metaphorically, it's kind of like adding, let's say, like molasses to a musical instrument or something like that. It's like maybe you can access those resonant modes more easily, but they're not the resonant modes of your normal nervous system. So I wonder, yeah, that might explain the resonant frequency is slightly different. It also like one of the fascinating pieces of research that came out about connectome-specific harmonic wave analysis is that LSD seems to actually increase the amplitude of all of the harmonics, but especially of the higher frequencies. And there's kind of a change in what is the median frequency of your nervous system in a higher direction. And I don't know, it's one of those things where, like, hippies have been saying forever, like, oh, LSD gives you access to like higher frequencies or something like that. But hey, like neuroscience is showing that, yeah, there's probably something to it. And finally, yeah, connecting it with kind of other psychedelics. One piece of research that we have at QRI is we created this tool for visualizing what's called visual tracers, which is like if you take LSD or something and you move your hand around, you might see kind of a lot of like lingering copies kind of stay for longer. Essentially, the decay of experience becomes kind of like these like fatter curve. Things like last longer in your experience. And we've asked people with a lot of psychedelic experience to essentially try to replicate the tracers they see on different drugs. And it does emerge that each drug has kind of like its own frequency range, where like, for example, LSD tends to produce like flickering frequencies of around like 15 to 20 hertz, whereas like something like DMT produces flickering frequencies of like 30 hertz or more. And yeah, I mean, subjectively, as often reported, is people try DMT and they'll say like, yeah, this is like LSD, but like a higher frequency. And yeah, now we have like at least some tools to kind of to explain that. But it does seem to me then that, yeah, I mean, essentially if you do want to have kind of like a sustainable long-term access to, yeah, kind of these absolute type experiences, potentially the most important is going to be to find the actual, harmonic resonant modes of your natural nervous system unaltered by these substances.
Right. Yeah, and that's what I see. The folks that have used this, even if they have made contact as they believe they have, when they come to, say, a meditation retreat, there's a period where they almost need to purify their consciousness a little more. I don't mean this in a judgmental way, but like they need to do it so that they can then access that same territory meditatively, because it's kind of like it's a little bit cloudy when they start, is how it feels to me.
Oh, interesting. Fascinating. I wonder one exception. I mean, I'm not entirely sure about this, but 5-MeO DMT, the toad one in particular, does seem to be extremely clean in its effect. Although I have like some slight contradictory information here with Roger Teasdale, which is a young guy who claims to be a fourth path, and he's been on the show with Whiston. He says that 5-MeO DMT, at least in his experience, does feel like it has like a slightly different frequency than his normal everyday type of awakening experience. But then we also have Shenzhen Young, who actually recently tried 5-MeO DMT. And the way he described it, he said it was like completely undistinguishable from his the kind of like ego death that he had after like 100 days of very rigorous Vajrayana practice. So essentially, Shenzhen Young thinks he's actually the real deal, whereas like Roger Teasdale thinks he's slightly different. But of all the psychedelics, I would say, yeah, 5-MeO DMT, the toad one, seems to me the most promising when it comes to maybe catalyzing experiences of the absolute. Just the depth to which you can go, it's really, really extraordinary. That like on LSD, you may have like experiences of like becoming one with everything, but it doesn't seem to go as deep in just like the degree to which you disidentify with absolutely any form of perception. Whereas on 5-MeO DMT, there is a feeling that like you can't actually go any further than where it takes you. Like there's almost kind of like it's hitting the maximum on some level. Yeah, go ahead.
Now I haven't taken 5-MeO, but from reports and what you've written about it and what I've heard other people say, I think 5-MeO might have more in common. I'm sure it's actually different subtly, or maybe significantly, but I think it might have more in common with formless absorptions. So there's no sense of a body, there's no sense of body boundary, there's just very little going on, and there might be a sense of infinite. I mean, you can fill in the phenomenology better than I can, but it is a kind of boundless, non-dual type experience without any sense of body or subject and object, and yet you said you can't go any deeper. I think from a traditional Buddhist perspective, well, actually there is just one step further than that, which would be the cessation type experience or some of the deeper formless absorptions. And yeah, I thought I'd interject with that.
Yeah, well, I mean, like if you take enough 5-MeO DMT, you experience a whiteout, and like it might be a cessation potentially. I mean, I don't know, but like it's possible it may like be maxing out sort of like the coherence of your nervous system or something like that, and there's like a global maximum and it just takes you there. But yeah, I mean, like in terms of like formless absorption, like a common report on 5-MeO DMT is like as you're coming down, you have this weird feeling of realizing like, wait, there's a world that has beings. Like you were just so deeply gone into kind of the formless absorption, like you completely had forgotten that like even such a thing as like there being like, you know, a universe with entities or anything of the sort, like that's totally gone. You're, yeah, almost, yeah, this feeling of like gone to such an extent that it's almost as if you had never been born, is like how some people describe it.
Can they repeat any of those experiences without the drug after having a drug experience?
So definitely, there's something interesting here, which is at QRI we sometimes do this thing. It's called Phenomenology Club, where like we bring together people who have had like really extreme experiences in one way or another. And don't ask me why, but like by now I actually know 4 people who have taken 5-MeO-DMT every day for at least 1 month. 2 of them actually like having done it like every day for 6 months. And of those 4 people, 2 of them report actually having like experienced like permanent shifts in their consciousness. But it's not something that happened after like 1 or 2 experiences, but it was kind of like you needed the momentum of like doing it every day for a month. And one of them reports kind of like I think it's like 4th path, like that he said like that, like he had meditated a lot before, but like the 30-day 5-MeO experience is what actually pushed him over the edge to a permanent shift. Again, all of this needs to be cross-examined, and it would be great to have like people like you interview or feel feel them to know if that's for real. But and I mean, based on 5-MeO-DMT experiences, it wouldn't surprise me that if you do it a lot, like may actually give you some permanent access to something. People also report like reactivations, especially on that substance, that like if you've taken 5-MeO-DMT like 3 or more times or something like that, oftentimes you may wake up at night just like suddenly in that state, kind of like fully reactivated, and seems to be associated with sleep in particular, like makes that happen.
Are there any downsides to taking the drug, or people that shouldn't use it or have adverse reactions?
So it is the drug that can give you the worst bad trip as well. I guess like that's really important to emphasize, that like just that it can create kind of like the most clean kind of pure consciousness type experience. Well, I don't know if the most clean, but like at least a variant of it. Resistance to it, subliminal resistance to merging with the absolute can be such a unpleasant experience that some people become like traumatized and they never want to take the drug again, and they swear off any kind of psychedelic for the rest of their life because it was just such a horrible experience. And predicting how, like, to whom that's going to happen is obviously very difficult, but the main factor that I have identified with like a lot of interviews of people who've taken this substance a lot is that the main kind of feature that, at least for them, like predicts whether they'll have a good or bad experience has to do with the rate of administration. That essentially, if you take a very big hit of 5-MeO-DMT, all of a sudden, it's kind of like this huge rush of energy can kind of like leave an imprint, and then you're like working through kind of the wake of that rush of energy. But if you're titrating the dose slowly over the course of like, let's say 10-20 minutes, then you kind of like have like time to acclimatize to it. And I mean, I suspect like therapeutic protocols will probably involve like kind of like self-directed titration with an injection pump or something like that, where you have full control of how much of the substance you're getting and how fast. Okay. Winston, you were gonna say something.
I hadn't heard the thing about the sleep, which is interesting, because I also know someone who studied with Shyla Catherine, I think, so doing the kind of Visuddhimagga type jhana, who reports not uncommonly waking up mid-sequence in the middle of the night, kind of in one of the first 4 form jhanas, especially during or recently following a retreat. So that's kind of interesting, an interesting parallel. But I hadn't I guess my sense of this question that Stephen was asking is, do these people have intentional access? So like, can they voluntarily shift in the course of their day? You know, they sit down, can they get into that kind of formless absorption from a baseline? And I haven't heard of people being able to do that, which would correlate with my understanding of other psychedelics, that it's kind of a peak experience that then doesn't afford that much reentry, if you like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the drug is really doing a lot of the work then. In other words, it's not opening a permanent channel where like meditatively what we see is as people access these jhanas repeatedly, there gets to be such a path that's been cut up the mountain that they can access that regularly on similar retreat setting, whether at home or in a center.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I have not heard, I haven't heard like, reported like specifically that, they can sit down and experience that at will. And one of them, one of the two who actually took it like every day for 6 months. I mean, he did it in the Advaita Vedanta tradition. So like his emphasis was like on oneness in particular. I mean, he reported he experienced like some shifts, but that I mean, meditation retreats actually did more for him than that. One interesting thing is essentially like one way of like describing 5-MeO DMT, especially if you don't go all the way, is accessing all of the different flavors of silence that like you may experience. For example, a 5-MeO DMT experience, which is like perfect kind of like feeling of like nothingness in the visual field, and like that might be kind of the object of attention. Then in another session, you may experience like auditory silence, just like the most clean silence, but like, very a huge depth of silence. Or you may experience kind of like bodily peace, just kind of like this perfect. So that is also like one reason why we find it so interesting at QRI, is because it also has kind of this connection of symmetry and smoothness, and also like reported like sense of well-being that comes with it.
Would there be people that it's not indicated for?
Yeah, I wonder. I mean, but I definitely would advise against if you have like, schizophrenia, or like maybe a lot of latent mental illness in your family or something like that. But we don't really have like much data on that substance.
Okay. Yeah, I just have seen the folks that I know, the ones that, today there's a lot of people who are suffering with anxiety and depression. I mean, a growing number of folks. And those folks also seem to be the ones that have tried the different psychedelics. It seems to impact them a little differently, where it kind of leaves them a little foggier in some ways afterwards. And there could be clarity in the experience, but I don't know, perhaps because of their ongoing depression, anxiety, it's a different landing than, say, someone who doesn't routinely encounter those qualities.
Yeah, it's for 5-MeO in particular. I mean, like the typical reaction is one of like if people do it in a shamanic setting and they have a good experience, and I mean, roughly speaking, we're talking about like 95% of people report like, the experience was very positive. Even if they had like a lot of anxiety and depression, essentially they tend to describe it as kind of like a nervous system reset, and like they got like a new lease on life. It's common description. But yeah, I mean, LSD, I'm not so sure that like, I mean, if you suffer from like generalized anxiety, LSD might just give you panic attacks. So
Right.
yeah.
And that's part of the concern that I have for those folks, and some of them have had that apparently. They've tried these things and it did land them, and they just stayed in heightened anxiety for hours. So yeah, I think you have to be careful with terms of what kind of stability you have if we're introducing some of these things, or really investigate, find out, talk to someone like you who can give them some of us some understanding.
Yeah. I guess the last note on this is that it also seems that the dose matters enormously, especially for 5-MeO DMT, in that like really it's almost kind of like 5 different drugs depending on what dose you take. and like extremely small doses, like very, very small doses of 5-MeO DMT seem to me like inherently very meditative in that like they settle everything down, and it's kind of like this very calm and relaxing experience that doesn't feel like intoxicated. It's a very, very strange, but like very clean kind of like settling down. And I suspect probably when it comes to like interface between psychedelics and meditation, probably low dose 5-MeO DMT at a retreat might be one of the kind of like ways in which it might actually be synergistic and not cause the cloudiness that you're describing, but yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, that's true too, because the other aspect that what comes to mind is it's also going to be a particular controlled experience. If you're at a retreat center, you've got, the person doesn't have the usual stimulus of family and friends and computer and phones and all that. So there is kind of a cleaner experience in terms of silence. So that would be, it would strike me that would be kind of beneficial conditions as well.
Yeah. One topic, I mentioned what I wanted to briefly touch upon, and like I wonder what your thoughts on this is the Brahmavihārās in the context of kind of an adversarial relationship, which I think it can be like kind of a crazy head trip. Unfortunately, like for example, somebody might tell you that the reason you're doing Brahmavihāra practice is in order to hide from the ways in which you are evil, for example. Mm-hmm. And like it's could potentially be difficult to cultivate it under those circumstances, especially if you actually really care about the other person. Like, I mean, that's just one example of kind of the difficulties that might happen if there's actually some kind of adversarial component to it. And I mean, I wonder if you have any thoughts on that matter.
Well, where I see that come up the most would be in terms of the application of daily life, meaning you've got a partner who you love and you're with, but you're having a friction exchange, you're having an argument, disagreement. And so part of the Brahmavihāra practice would be to try to bring that into the situation you're in. So one of the first things, the way that I teach it, is to work with the equanimity, and which is really accepting the truth. So if you and I are arguing right now, and if one of us or both of us start orienting towards that, just accepting the fact this is what's happening, we're having this disagreement, we care about each other, but there's this friction, then that at least gets us away from the different inner resistances we have, pull this, push that to get the optimum distance. And then once there's acceptance, then we can move into things like moving into how it feels, what we call in Buddhism dukkha, which is unsatisfactoriness up to suffering. And we get in touch with the suffering, how I feel a lot of pain that we're having this disagreement. It hurts. And when we have these things, I feel the history, the past, and then project into the future. And by doing that, by being in touch with the suffering directly, I'm also inviting the quality of compassion, the quality of true nature, to come forward and help hold it. It doesn't solve it or take it away, but it helps hold the fact that I'm in this turmoil, right? We're in this conflict, and it helps then soften some of my stances, which would be a little more strident in the course of an argument. So I'm softening, the field is softening, and I'm probably starting to feel more about my caring for the other rather than my judgment and anger. And so that right there sort of progresses it to where even this is all done non-verbally, we've now created a different environment in which to interact.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah, so I guess equanimity to start, to accept the conditions of the disagreement or the difficulty.
Well, and landing here, because so often we're in our heads, we're planning what we're going to say, we're playing again what we just said. But this is landing here in this dynamic.
Mm-hmm. Okay, adding a twist to this, what if the other person is very anti-meditation? Like they might think, meditation is a kind of brainwashing or a way to kind of convince yourself that you're better than you are, or like, whatever story they may have against meditation. And they think that if you bring something like loving kindness or equanimity, they think you're tricking them. You're actually changing the topic or something like that.
This could
Yeah.
be all done non-verbally. I could be doing all this without you knowing a thing of what I'm doing, nor would I require you to necessarily participate. I'm saying some couples, they both know it, where others, it's one or the other. And that's one of the ways I tell students how to gauge how well you're doing with the Brahmavihārās. Are your relationships improving? And if they are, typically that means you're landing more and more in the Brahmavihārās.
Interesting, interesting. Yeah, that makes me think of, maybe coming up with a overall relationship quality score. There might be something like this in in psychology, but as a way of tracking your progress in Brahmavihārās over months. And just to briefly circle back, and I know we're barely past the time, but what would you recommend to people who suffer from psychopathy or sociopathy?
I'm not sure what those are.
Who may be like self-aware and maybe
people have trouble with self-awareness.
Yeah, or like I get like people who,
is that what you're saying?
Oh, no, people who suffer from sociopathy or psychopathy, or like essentially people who have like high levels of the dark triad, like very Machiavellic, sadistic, and forget what the last one is.
So people like the people that some of your students are helping in prison, who have a very difficult time accessing these heart qualities. Is there any advice for that type of person? Is it possible in the end for them to contact these qualities, or is there some other type of meditation that might bring that in or open a door to those qualities? I don't know if you have any experience with that directly.
Yeah, I would say that it seems that they are able to access it. One of the ways that I teach it is because it's a quality of our true nature and it stems from the absolute, it isn't conditioned. So meaning a lot of us exclude ourselves because we think, well, I've done these bad things. I've done horrible things. I don't qualify to go here. And so there's a kind of self-exclusion, a self-judgment that keeps them out. And so part of my teaching is that there's the unconditioned quality of the absolute doesn't care about anything, any of that. That's all human conceptual framing. This is a pure love that loves everything equally, which is God's favorite tree. There can't be one. So in the same way, how can that love be conditioned? That's here. So we're all equally entitled. So nothing you've done can exclude you. And you have every much a birthright to this as everybody else. And so that seems to help quite a lot, because that's one of the ways we exclude ourselves, is that sense of that's that core ego deficiency. I'm bad, I'm helpless, I'm unlovable, I'm worthless, all that. And again, none of that matters because it's not a conditioned response to the Brahmavihāra, the love you're contacting.
Thanks so much for that, Stephen. And how are we for time? Do we have a few more minutes, or do people need to get going?
I can go a little longer today, but then I'll need to move on, unfortunately.
Thanks so much for the time you both have given already. I'm wondering, I think it might be interesting for Andrés, and I'd like you to weigh in on this. I was reading the last section. I was finishing up your book on the Brahmavihārās while I was on vacation, Stephen. And you conclude the book in a very interesting and illuminating way. You describe the kind of exit from the absolute cessation up through the formless realms back to the ordinary world we find ourselves within. And I'm curious if like a verbal report of that experience would maybe help Andrés at all, kind of not that you can conceptualize these experiences and have them at the same time, but would that be of interest, and is that something you'd be willing to do?
Are you saying to describe it?
Describe it, yeah.
just what that journey would be.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned, is that interesting to you, Andres?
Yeah, very much so.
Well, as I mentioned, the formless jhanas, the fifth through eighth jhana, are really differentiated qualities of the absolute. So, like we're on the way up, we're really getting steeped in the vastness of infinite space, and then we're really getting steeped in just the vastness of infinite consciousness. And then the same with no thingness. I don't call it nothing because nothing, again, has a lot of meaning in English, but no thing, that makes it better. That's really the more felt experience there. And neither perception or non-perception just means non-conceptual. It's direct awareness without any ability to reference, like this tastes like chicken. There's no memory of chicken to compare it to. It's just there's this. And then finally the absolute, which is the source. And again, I mentioned there's the unmanifest, which is really characterized by darkness, by absence, qualities of peace and stillness. And the manifest side is characterized by presence, so a substantial here-ness, a beingness, coupled with pure love. So a love that is unconditioned in every way. And then there's also pure awareness there. So there's, again, perception without reflection. You have direct experience, but there's no conceptual memory you can compare to. And so that ends up moving, the awareness moves from that experience into neither perception or non-perception, so into direct non-conceptual. So you can see it's just you're getting one flavor. And then to the no thingness, which is really more pointing to the emptiness and the fact that there's, in the absolute, substantiality and insubstantiality at the same time. So part of the paradox of it. And then pure consciousness or boundless consciousness, same thing. There's no end, there's no limit to it at all. And then, as I mentioned, space, and space holds form. So then we move through the form jhanas backwards, and each of the jhanas gets closer and closer to ordinary consciousness. Because in the fourth jhana, all of them have characterized by no sense of self. There's no sense of me at all, but there's pure awareness and there's consciousness in the jhanas. And so that comes, there's a whole range of things that we do in between there, but it comes back down to the ordinary consciousness and accessing the first jhana.
Can I ask a clarifying question? And thank you so much for providing that description for us. Yeah, may I?
Sure.
So in your description of the what you describe as the absolute realm, you describe certain qualities to it. Is this kind of an intermediary zone between the last of the formless jhanas and cessation, the source itself, or is this the manifest side, just the beginnings of manifestation, just around cessation? Is that, maybe that's a poor way to describe it, but...
Well, cessation would be the source. That would be where all of it originates, because that's where the silence and the power and such are all reside. And cessation is really, and awareness go deep enough where we can feel any sense of self or body is fading and dropping, and then language begins to slow and eventually stop. And so we then move into awareness and consciousness, and then at some point those shut off. There's a lights out. But what one has to reconcile with is the fear, the worry, the terror, because we can tell we're going to be entering into this undifferentiated quality, and we also are clear we don't know exactly how to undifferentiate again. How to separate again. We don't have that skill. It's all done based on something in the mystery. So we have to reconcile the fact that we're facing our own elimination of existence or ending of existence. And there's a lot of course, the self-preservation instincts get triggered like mad in that territory. So that's part of the reconciliation that has to happen, the trust that has to be built to let go.
Thank you.
And how I describe it is really just, it's been my experience, and in teaching, I'm seeing students reporting, whether it's based on my influence of this is how I'm describing my experience, or if there's this matching, I can't say. But I'm hearing reports that are similar to what I'm communicating.
Do you feel, I guess, yeah, my last question, and this definitely touches on issues of personal identity. And I mean, one thing we definitely take seriously at QRI is exotic perspectives on identity. That like this idea of like you start existing when you're born and stop existing when you die might be kind of potentially illusory or just like surface reality. And like there might be the deeper reality of oneness, or potentially that each moment of experience is its own different being. But it sounds to me, based on your description, that yeah, if the jhanas, especially the formless jhanas, have this quality of forgot how you put it, but yes, like no self. Does it feel like / do you believe that on some level you're actually accessing kind of the truth of unity, or becoming it, rather than just like kind of like representing it in your experience, and whether that distinction makes sense?
Yeah, it's not a representation because there's no sense of self. So it does feel like you are actually entering into a realm. Because particularly with the form jhanas, it feels as though awareness exits through the crown chakra. So it feels like you're actually leaving the territory of the body and leaving the territory of physical manifestation. So that's part of the experience. So, but the reports from virtually everybody I know that's had those experiences is it feels like you're entering a different realm. And that's why we call it the realm. Sometimes referred to as the realm rather than formless. So anyway, I'm not saying it right, but it does feel like you're away.
So one maybe I hope this is not an information hazard. I don't think so, but like I mean something that is like scary a little bit on like, for example, ego death experiences on LSD and things like that. I wonder if this is also an issue is with the formless jhanas is the feeling that like, well, when you're exiting your sense of self or your current container, you don't know who you're going to come back as. You kind of like erase that information, and especially when you introduce concepts of eternity and timelessness and things like that, is like, I mean, I don't know if I'm gonna land back on, let's say, I don't know, a pig in a factory farm, and it's like, okay, darn, like that's gonna suck so bad. So like I wonder if like that might be a potential, I don't know, like fear / issue that might arise.
I've never heard that one or experienced it, so I don't think there's a concern about it. If I leave, am I going to come back to the same sense of self, the same body? There may be some sense that we can tell that things are changing. So I'm not going to land back in exactly the same way that I left. I think that would be a common perception, but not I'm going to miss my landing and end up a half a world apart, away in some other body or something. I've never heard anybody express concern about that. Once they hear our broadcast, maybe that'll become a new concern people have, but presently not.
Hopefully not. Excellent. Well, those are all the burning questions I have. There's so much we could discuss, but this has been very wonderful. I really appreciate it. It's
nice spending time with you both. Interesting conversation, and the work on consciousness, I'm sure, is going to be terribly important for all of us.
Thank you both so much for coming along and having this conversation. Stephen, where can people find you?
On my website. I'm not actually there, but they can find out what I'm doing there, awakeningdharma.org. And then I've got some retreats coming up. The big one next year, we've got a 2-week retreat in Croatia. I just got back from Croatia and had a retreat, and I just loved it. It was a wonderful country and amazing food and just a great setting. So we'll be doing a 2-week, 1 week samatha. Week 2 will be on awakening.
All right. So for retreats, books, and everything else, you can go to Stephen's website, awakeningdharma.org. I'll put the link in the description. And Andrés?
You can find my personal blog, qualiacomputing.com, and then where I work, qualiaresearchinstitute.org. Oh, and finally, my YouTube channel. Like, just look up my name, and there is Gómez Emilsson on YouTube, and you'll see like dozens of videos about consciousness, all sorts of topics.
Okay. Thanks so much for coming again, and thank you everybody for watching. May you all be perfectly well.